Hola, sean bienvenidos amantes de las películas, documentales, cortometrajes de todas las edades, tamaños, lugares, épocas, colores y formas. Es el jodido 7mo vicio, solo por las pantallas de Vía X. ¿Dije programa de cine? En esta ocasión, ¿qué pueden tener que ver Phil Anselmo? Contándonos sus pasajes oscuros, su espiral de adicción a las drogas, como también confesándonos en primera persona que es un extremista en todo lo que se refiere a la vida y que lo hace sentir. Por eso, uno de los frontman más poderosos, con esa voz que quedó patentada en nuestros oídos y que mierda casi lo hizo añicos en su saga de discos junto a Pantera, va a dar testimonio de algunos de los pasajes más duros de su vida. ¿Y qué puede tener que ver eso con, por ejemplo, Trent Reznor, hablándonos del mítico show de Nine Inch Nails en Woodstock de 1994? Pero además, sus pasajes de autodestrucción. Sí, porque él es el Mr. Self-Destruct. ¿Has escuchado de Downward Spiral? Él es el Mr. Self-Destruct. Contándonos además cómo luchó contra su propio ego y casi perdió esa batalla. Como también vamos a conocer al prolífico músico, spoken word notable, Black Flag, en lo musical, de Henry Rollins Band. Es propio anfitrión de su propio show de televisión, Henry Rollins, hablándonos honestamente sobre cuál él cree es la solución para todos los problemas de la sociedad moderna, la educación. Y además, vamos a ver a Eddie Vedder y unos encuentros emocionantes, conmovedores con niños muy especiales, donde además Eddie Vedder nos va a revelar anécdotas increíbles sobre Pearl Jam. Señores, en un análisis imperdible que sacamos de Nerdwriter y subtitulamos para ustedes, vamos a saber por qué Bob Dylan obtuvo el premio Novel de Literatura. Porque su canción All Along the Watchtower, perteneciente al disco John Wesley Harding de 1967, que a propósito, esa canción All Along the Watchtower es la que más veces Bob Dylan ha tocado en vivo, 1400 veces aproximadamente. Y como esa canción, en tan solo entre comillas, 12 líneas, 130 palabras y 2 minutos 30 de duración, es capaz de transmitirte más mensajes, simbologías y posibles significados que novelas, trilogías de novelas completas. Ese análisis sobre esa canción de Bob Dylan es maravilloso. Como además vamos a indagar nuevamente, cortesía de Nerdwriter, sobre las carátulas y los significados ocultos de los Beatles. Sean bienvenidos a esta caja de Pandora, Mulinex cósmica, que mezcla películas, documentales, análisis, lo que sea, llamada el 7mo vicio. Les recuerdo que DVD Planet, la mejor tienda de películas de nuestro país, estamos grabando el 7mo vicio en la nueva y flamante tienda que queda aquí en Los Dos Caracoles, Metro Estación Los Leones, pleno Providencia. DVD Planet tiene para ustedes este concurso, esta canasta Oscar espectacular que está apareciendo en estos momentos en pantalla. Desde Hacksaw Ridge hasta El Último Hombre, pasando por Arrival, la película preciosa y poética de Denis Villeneuve, como Moonlight, la ganadora del Oscar, Kubo and the Two Strings, esa preciosura artesanal stop motion, con esos orfebres mágicos de miurgos que son los de Laika. Todas las películas que están apareciendo en estos momentos en pantalla, y por supuesto Manchester by the Sea, de Kenneth Lonergan, una de mis favoritas. Todas estas películas para un solo ganador, todas en formato Blu-ray. Recuerden que DVD Planet siempre tiene, antes que todos los demás, las últimas películas en 3D, en 4K, las series de televisión de antaño, clásicos. Los últimos estrenos los encuentras aquí al precio más conveniente y con una atención personalizada. ¿Cómo concursar? Muy fácil, le das me gusta al Facebook de Planet Limited y luego te diriges al Facebook del 7mo vicio. Además estén muy atentos por estos días al Facebook del programa porque vamos a tener entradas, invitaciones exclusivas para el estreno de La Bella y la Bestia en nuestro país. A propósito, que divertido está el chiste de Deadpool con respecto a... ¿Se metieron a la cuenta de Deadpool? Métanse, está muy divertida su tomadura de pelo a La Bella y la Bestia. Vamos a tener el tráiler en esta sesión de Las Niñas Arañas, estreno nacional de mayo y muchísimas cosas más. Pero vamos a partir con uno de mis directores favoritos, Terrence Malick, un espécimen único, cuyas películas perfectamente pueden ser para algunos poesía pura, llevar al cine una especie de estado de gracia, elevado por la fotografía, la música, y con esos pasajes de diálogos que parecen hablar de todo lo importante en la vida. No sé si vieron La Delgada Línea Roja, Si vieron Badlands, una de mis películas favoritas, ojo, Natural Born Killers de Oliver Stone es muy deudora de Badlands. Hay varias conexiones entre ambas películas, pero bueno, a propósito, Natural Born Killers, la selección musical de eso y canciones de Nine Inch Nails figuran en ese puto grandioso soundtrack, cortesía para mí de lo que es el peak de Oliver Stone en el cine. Terrence Malick, creador de Days of Heaven, esa película con fotografía de Néstor Almendros, qué bonito apellido, Almendros, pues y esa fotografía es bien almendrada, es color almíbar, es color sepia, es color miel, como quieran llamarle, fotografía natural. Investiguen sobre todo lo que tiene que ver con fotografía Terrence Malick, de por qué se tomó un hiato, un paréntesis de 20 años entre Days of Heaven para realizar recién su siguiente película, La delgada línea roja. Y lo bueno de todo esto es que Terrence Malick, este director que tenía procesos lentos de elaboración cinematográfica, viene pasando por un estado de hiperactividad. Y si bien sus películas, algunas me gustan, otras no tanto, todavía está el Terrence Malick que más me gusta dentro de ellas. Es por eso que no sé por qué mierda todavía no se estrena Voyage of Time en nuestro país, ese documental que viene con una versión, narración de Brad Pitt en algunos casos, Kate Blanchett en otros casos, con música original de Ennio Morricone. Unas ganas de verlo. Y bueno, la gran noticia es que Song to Song, con Ryan Gosling, Michael Fassbender, Rooney Mara, Natalie Portman, sí se va a estrenar en nuestro país, cortesía de Diamond Films. Pasamos a ver el tráiler. Cría tráiler si te sacaran los ojos. Song to Song, que para mí parece una segunda parte de La La Land. ¿No es verdad? Ryan Gosling tocando el pianito y dije, ¡ay, sí te amo! Ya sabes que te amo desde La La Land, desde que hiciste eso, ¿no es verdad? Vamos con Song to Song y los espera un séptimo vicio para recordar. Así lo espero. Junto a mi equipo, Michael en cámara, Francisca Márquez, guía espiritual, editora, mujer renacentista, y Felipe Gutiérrez en la edición. El pelado Pi, Dr. Simi de las películas, les da la bienvenida. Welcome to my 7mo vicio. Vicious. Addiction. Fuck. Empezamos.
I'm walking in the rain. Tears are falling and I feel the pain. Wishing you were here by me to end this misery.
Say it like you mean it.
Say it like you mean it. Say it like you mean it. Say it like you mean it. Say it like you mean it.
Esta es la historia de iniciación artística de uno de los directores para mí más brillantes, con películas más mindfuck, más geniales de los últimos, no sé, 35 o 40 años. Desde Eraserhead, que David Lynch viene cambiando todos los muebles en el apartado cinematográfico, ¿me explico? Todo lo que parecía ser una película normal se va al tacho de la basura. Se rehace el cine a gusto. Si es que han visto películas como Mulholland Drive, Los Highway, sabrán eso, pero también sabrán que buena parte de su cine, o mejor lo voy a decir de esta manera, buena parte de su cine más raro, es el más normal. Si uno ve The Straight Story, es una película narrativamente lineal, convencional, y sin embargo, dentro de la filmografía de David Lynch, es un ¿qué? ¿Me explico? Nunca sabemos qué clase de cosa va a sacar David Lynch de su sombrero mágico. Un director que te hace pensar y reflexionar sobre los alcances que tiene y las oportunidades, posibilidades que ofrece el medio cinematográfico como expresión, como misterio. No sé ustedes, pero a mí me pasa muchas veces que no juego a entender de qué se tratan las películas de David Lynch. Y a ratos ni siquiera quiero penetrar realmente en los misterios. Quedo tan absorbido por sus mundos, sus personajes, sus diálogos, que no trato de hacer una explicación de eso. Porque muchas veces también lo intenté. En Eraserhead, en Mulholland Drive, en Los Highway, en Wild at Heart, aunque Wild at Heart tiene... Bueno, Wild at Heart es toda una piñata de sorpresa llena de referencias al Mago de Oz, a Elvis Presley, en fin. Pero ¿saben qué? Hubo un momento en el cual dije, en estas ganas de tener un significado, de buscar alguna explicación, de juntar todas las piezas del puzzle, que al final terminaba tan no sé si desilusionado de mi capacidad intelectual, pero entendí que no era un fracaso no entender de qué se trataban sus películas. Y sí, uno podía esbozar alguna especie de significado detrás, pero ya me encantaban por lo que eran, ¿me explico? Son como una especie de pintura. ¿Por qué el pintor te va a tener que explicar la pintura? La pintura se explica por sí sola para quien esté mirando y tiene interpretaciones y multiinterpretaciones para todo el mundo. Y puedes aborrecer a David Lynch, odiarlo, como también amarlo. David Lynch, sí, que alguna vez fue al psiquiatra y le preguntó al psiquiatra si es que ir a estas consultas podían afectar su proceso creativo. El psiquiatra dijo que podía ser y David Lynch no fue nunca más. Y esas películas como ahumadas en nicotina, no sabría definirlo de una forma mejor. No sé, tan solo verlo comer una donut ya me emociona. Cuando hablo de los avances de la nueva temporada de Twin Peaks, este 21 de mayo, uno de los sucesos de este 2017. Bueno, ¿qué tal tener un vistazo a dónde David Lynch o de dónde saca las ideas? Sí, sabemos que, como él ha explicado en la meditación trascendental, en sus charlas, nos dice que las ideas las saca como un pescador que va al propio océano de su mente y tira un anzuelo y se dedica allí horas, largos minutos, largos pasajes a esperar a ver qué pica. Este documental le tengo unas ganas pero increíbles. Se llama The Art Life of David Lynch. Sí, sean bienvenidos a un nuevo caso de linchamiento cerebral, como quieran llamarlo. Pero de dónde sacan sus ideas en este documental, de acuerdo a sus propias palabras, es tan cotidiano, está tan a vuelta de la esquina, y como los pequeños mundos, no salir quizás a veces de tu manzana, de tu cuadra, puede ofrecer tantas posibilidades de inspiración artística que uno dice, wow. Ojo, no es el único documental sobre David Lynch, también está Pretty as a Picture. Y en Netflix tengo que recomendarles My Beautiful Broken Brain, que vendría significando algo como mi hermoso cerebro roto, que nos muestra la historia de una chica de alrededor de 34 años, es el retrato de una chica de esa edad, más o menos, que sufre un accidente cerebrovascular hemorrágico traumático y registra todo su proceso de rehabilitación conociendo todo un nuevo mundo de colores y de sonidos. Ese documental, no lo menciono porque sí, está producido por David Lynch y lo pueden chequear a partir de ahora, sí que tienen Netflix. Pasamos a ver entonces The Art Life of David Lynch, que si no me equivoco se estuvo exhibiendo en el Centro de Extensión de la Católica en enero. ¡Puta la wea! ¿Cómo no me enteré? ¡Fuck! Pasamos a ver The Art Life de David Lynch.
Sickness, corruption, fear in the air. It was so good for me. I could imagine a whole world that doesn't exist. I had tremendous freedom. My own little place that really would be such a world.
¿Por qué ganó Bob Dylan el premio Novel de Literatura? No conozco mejor respuesta y mejor análisis que lo que hace el sitio, el canal de YouTube de Nerdwriter sobre la canción All Along the Watchtower, perteneciente al disco de 1967 de John Wesley Harding. All Along the Watchtower tiene 12 líneas, 130 palabras y dura tan solo, entre comillas, 2 minutos y medio. Y The Nerdwriter nos dice que todo el significado de esa canción, su contenido, es mucho más rico que novelas completas, trilogías de novelas completas. Con ustedes, una disección. ¿Sí? Esto es como Trek, ¿no es verdad? La filosofía de Trek. Hay que ir sacando la cebollita, descubriendo capita a capita las cosas. Y lo que hace Nerdwriter es realmente fabuloso. All Along the Watchtower y su exploración, su investigación aquí en el 7mo vicio.
You think you'll stick with folk rock, or are you going on into more writing?
I don't play folk rock.
What would you call your music?
I call it,
There must be some way out of here, said the joker to the thief. There's too much confusion, I can't get no relief.
So there are some novels, some trilogies, in fact, with less actual content than Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower. It's really astonishing what Dylan achieves in 12 lines, 130 words, and 2.5 minutes. I don't think I can explain the song definitively. I don't think anyone could do that with Dylan, but there's a lot here to explore. And the first thing to note is exactly when and where All Along the Watchtower fits in Dylan's career. The song is the fourth on his 1967 album John Wesley Harding, coming after two of his most famous and most celebrated records, Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde. Dylan had already gone electric, already repudiated much of the political significance he had in his first years, and alienated a lot of his folk music following in the process. His lyrics in those albums were lyrics of a man possessed, shot through with some magic spirit, singing gorgeously beautiful epics in a stream of allusions and vignettes. For this reason, John Wesley Harding can only come as a shock. It's totally spare instrumentation, mostly guitar, bass, and drums under vocals and harmonica, and largely 2 to 3 minute songs strike a bold contrast not only to his previous albums, but to the maximalist psychedelic feeling of 1967, the same year that the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which, by the way, Dylan called, quote, very indulgent. Despite this, Dylan's 8th album was universally praised, and rightly so. It's among the tightest work he's ever released, both conceptually in the themes found in the 12-song cycle and lyrically. There's no line that you can stick your finger through, he said in 1968. There's no hole in any of the stanzas. There's no blank filler. Each line has something. In All Along the Watchtower, there are exactly 12 lines, a parable framed as a conversation between two archetypes, a joker and a thief. The joker speaks first, looking for a way out of here, though we don't quite know where here is, then complaining that businessmen drink his wine, plowmen dig his earth, while neither of them know what those things are worth. The thief responds saying that there's no reason to get excited. Those people may feel that life is a joke, but we know better because we've been through that already. The story then pulls back to a watchtower where there is some kind of commotion as watchmen notice two riders approaching in the cold distance. The final quatrain is a little bit jarring. It's almost as if it's misplaced in time. It's been suggested, in fact, that the last lines are actually chronologically the first in the story. And by doing this, Dylan gives the song a kind of endless circular feel, the story always wrapping around to the start again, emphasizing just how futile the Joker's first comment is.
There must be some way out of here.
Of course, it's unclear whether the two riders spotted from the watchtower are the Joker and the thief, or whether the Joker and the thief spot them, or some other configuration. And for that matter, it's worth questioning who exactly these two figures are. Some think that the Joker is Dylan, while the thief is Elvis, who stole African-American music for white pop culture. Others see the two figures as two sides of Dylan's own personality, before and after the horrible motorcycle accident that in many ways generated this new style of music. Still others see the Joker as Jesus in conversation with one of the thieves that was crucified alongside him.
You ever read the Bible?
And making biblical connections isn't that far-fetched. There are some 70 biblical allusions in John Wesley Harding, all told, and those close to Dylan remember him repeatedly consulting a large version of the King James Bible at his home in Woodstock. Several people have noted the similarities between this song and a passage from the book of Isaiah, chapter 21 to be exact. It's a passage that prophesies the fall of Babylon and the Jews' return from exile to Jerusalem. Dylan spent much of his early career fighting off the label of prophet. It's a responsibility he felt was thrust on him illegitimately. But here he seems to accept the role, laying down an apprehensive, apocalyptic scenario as if to say, you want a prophecy? Okay, I'll give you a prophecy. But it comes at a price. The price is mystery and entrapment, a prophecy the meaning of which is forever out of reach. He casts himself in the role of Joker, thief, narrator, Jesus, and prophet, while simultaneously removing any anchoring personal presence like you might find in his previous work. By the end, the audience is left in as much fearful anticipation of what's to come as the reader of Yeats's Second Coming, as a great beast, impossible to fathom, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Where this gets really compelling for me, though, is in the actual music. A lot of people prefer Jimi Hendrix's version of this song, and obviously it's incredibly fantastic. But for me, the sonic quality of Dylan's original fits perfectly with this narrative. At the heart of the song is a driving guitar and bass chord progression, which, once it's repeated a few dozen times, locks you into a hypnotic momentum. Onto this is added Dylan's call and response lyrics, with each line comprising two parts that swing pendulum-like back and forth in his singing, never varying outside of a narrow lane of pitch, more overtones of being trapped. The high-pitched relentlessness of the harmonica interludes just fray the nerves, adding to the sense of apprehension and foreboding that the song is trying to create in us.
All along the watchtower, princes kept the view.
Dylan is conversing here with two of his favorite musical genres. The song is technically a folk ballad, albeit a short one. It's a story told as a conversation that aims to convey a message. But the fingerprints of the blues are everywhere on this song, namely one of Dylan's heroes, Robert Johnson, who, the legend has it, sold his soul to the devil for musical genius.
And the day keeps on wearing me, it's a hellhound on my trail.
Like Dylan, Johnson told evocative stories with dark undertones on songs with simple, repetitive structures. And I think that's the key to the power of this song. All Along the Watchtower delivers its prophecy of impending doom onto a steady and unfaltering foundation, something that points backward to both his roots in folk and to the black roots of rock and roll. It was Bob Dylan's great gift that he could take something that orients itself toward the past and push himself and his music forward. It's the music that makes All Along the Watchtower a cryptic prophecy that you can't escape, something that teases you in and always at the end begins.
There must be some way out of here, said the joker to the thief.
Conozco pocas voces que me transmitan un refugio, un abrigo, en tiempos de, no sé, soledad, tormenta amorosa, no encontrar tu lugar en el mundo, dilemas existenciales, como quieran llamarlos. Conozco pocas voces que me arropen como la de Eddie Vedder, Pearl Jam. Y además es un tipo, por lo que uno detecta en sus entrevistas, en la letra de sus canciones, por supuesto, y en su voz, uno detecta una sensibilidad, una forma de sentir las cosas única, que se siente cercana. No es el artista, entre comillas, que siente y hace que ese sentimiento se aparte de ti, porque está envuelto en cosas demasiado intelectuales. O lo explica de una forma a través de sus canciones que se siente incluso lejana. No, es el tipo que te hace sentir en carne propia, con su voz, sus letras y las canciones con Pearl Jam. También las que componen, por ejemplo, el soundtrack de Into the Wild, de la película de Sean Penn. Y no sé, se te meten debajo de la piel. Y sientes que estás sintiendo lo que él está sintiendo y encuentras pasajes similares en tu propia vida. Eddie Vedder para mí en ese sentido es una voz, es un letrista universal. Que un tipo con sus dilemas, sus problemas familiares, lo que sea en Estados Unidos, le venga a hacer sentido a un chileno. Desde los 15 años en adelante, que fue cuando yo descubrí Ten, por supuesto, y de ahí Versus, en fin, hace que sea todo algo mágico, ¿no es verdad? Y es ahí donde está la verdadera potencia de la música. Rompe barreras culturales, rompe barreras de idioma, y sientes que Eddie Vedder es uno de tus pares finalmente. Que podrías tener una conversación increíble con él, hablando de la vida. ¿No les pasa a ustedes eso? Bueno, quiero que tengan una muestra del nivel de empatía de Eddie Vedder junto en algunas entrevistas muy especiales que hemos reclutado, seleccionado en el 7mo vicio, donde además cuenta anécdotas sobre Pearl Jam, encuentros especiales con niños especiales en este momento especial para ustedes.
How did you come up with your band's name?
Well, that's a good question. That's kind of tricky. I thought this was going to be easy. I thought you were going to ask me like easy questions. Well, it's a bit of a long story. My grandma
was married to an Indian, my great-great-grandma, and her name was Pearl, and she made this jam, and then the Indian guy put something like mushrooms in it, so it was this funny kind of jam, but that's how we got the name.
Do you enjoy pouring?
Well, I do. It's nice when I can bring my family, because I have 2 daughters now. So if I have to play and they have to stay home and be in school, then it makes it harder, because then I have to be away from home. I'd rather be hanging out with the girls, but it's a really great job. And I get to meet all kinds of great people like you.
Something I wanted to express publicly, and I'm an example of someone who never made it to university. I never applied for a student loan. In the age of 19, I had some manual labor skills, but in 1984, the minimum wage was $3.35. I struggled to find a way into the workforce. At the same time, I had I wanted to be self-sustaining, and I did have this dream to become a musician. And I felt this dream had an expiration date. Unlike the 5 for $1 top ramen noodle packets that I was living off of, which never seemed to go bad. But in this quest to somehow improve my lot in life, at one point I saw a small listing in the Want ads. It talked about a security guard training program. And it was a government program where you went to class for 2 weeks. They gave you the training in order to qualify for the particular license needed, and then would attempt to place you in the workforce, and at a rate of maybe $5 or $6 an hour. So for me, it actually worked out beautifully. I was placed, I took over the midnight shift, a perfect job for an insomniac, and within 4 years I was actually the security supervisor of a well-respected petroleum company in San Diego. And but it was that job that allowed me to also afford the guitars and tape recorder and microphones that I needed to keep working on music. So for me, and it was also the job that I reluctantly left to move up to Seattle for less pay in order to join a band. It all worked out. But really, for me, it all began with that ability to get the proper training to get a decent job.
El cerebro y batuta de Nine Inch Nails, y además compositor de alguna música, de algunas bandas sonoras para películas, por ejemplo, de David Fincher, nos habla sobre sus pasajes oscuros de autodestrucción. Sí, él es Mr. Self-Destruct, si que han escuchado de Downward Spiral. Ese disco que Tori Amos definió como si estaba volando en avión y sentía que el avión iba a estrellarse, sentía que el momento perfecto para ese momento era ponerse los audífonos y escuchar The Downward Spiral. Johnny Cash dijo que había escuchado pocas canciones escritas al nivel de Hurt. Y así, por ejemplo, me pongo a ver Rick and Morty y la segunda temporada termina con Hurt. En uno de los finales más conmovedores que yo haya visto. Y es así como Trent Reznor tiene una presencia a veces invisible para muchos, a veces más visible, pero mucho que tiene que ver con la cultura que anda dando vueltas. Bueno, él mismo abre la puerta de su lado oscuro y te cuenta los pasajes de autodestrucción, la espiral de drogas, las luchas con su ego. Y también sobre el mítico show de Nine Inch Nails, que transformó una banda un poco under y se pegó el salto al mainstream en Woodstock de 1994. Ya lo sabemos. Si la honestidad no es frutal, no es honestidad.
Take me slightly back, though. When you were talking about that period with the Woodstock and Downward Spiral, so much success, right from the first album by Nine Inch Nails, and for decades after, or for a few years after, your music and your life traveled some pretty heavy, dark places. So, looking back, how do you feel you coped with that massive success?
poorly. No, I mean, looking back now, I don't think I was ever that well equipped to deal with what was coming. You know, I don't know that anybody is, but I started writing music because I had to get something out of my head, and it had to come out one way or another. And it was therapy, and it was cathartic, and it felt like I took something terrible and I turned it into something that might have some beauty or worth to it. And it was able to kind of take any talent I thought I had around that thing and turn it into something that gave me some sense of self-worth. And those first songs that I was afraid to play for anybody, I realized had some kind of truth in there or integrity that might give them power. You know, there was something that was honest in that. And that was the first album. And what happened then, as it started to seep its way out into the world and connect with people over time, was the greatest feeling I could ever imagine. And even, you know, looking back in my life, that feels like one of the best times of my life, where I was actually out playing in front of strangers, playing music that I wrote, in my bedroom, you know, and seeing people yelling lyrics back at it, and it means something to them. And I'm thinking, this is what this music that I've listened to, that I've read into, I'm doing that for other people. Wow, there's a point to all this. And as that kind of grew and the stakes seemed to get higher and audiences got bigger, creepier people seemed to infiltrate their way into your world. And for me, I started realizing that because I didn't feel like I had a armor on, I didn't feel like I'd created some kind of persona that was this character. I wasn't Alice Cooper, and then off stage I was somebody else. You know, I was just trying to be me. I would start to, you know, because the press likes to make things up or kind of portray you as something, you know, it's their job in a sense. And I was certainly feeding that. I started thinking I was the person I'd read about. And I started losing who I thought I was, you know, and against that backdrop, having a drink after a show turned into a couple drinks after a show, and maybe a couple drinks before a show, and then maybe a couple drinks. You know, and that can creep up, particularly in a situation where you're touring. And we toured, Downward Spiral, we toured for almost 3 years solid, you know, without even a place to come home to. Because it just seems stupid. Why would I have an apartment, you know? And which I highly recommend not doing to anybody that thinks that makes sense. And eventually it caught up with me, you know, and I've found myself as a full-blown addict, you know, that with all the ugliness that comes with it and the self-loathing and, you know, looking in the mirror and thinking, I don't know how I wound up. How did I get to this point, you know? And then the inevitable several years of addressing that and dealing with it and thinking I dealt with it, but not really, because I was going to do it on my terms, and then learning that lesson. It's boring stuff, you know. Read any biography, and there's some chapter in there that has something about that. But it happened, and I'm dealing with it, and I came out the other side, and I feel I wish I could have condensed that time into a tenth as much time as I wasted in that era, but you know, that's how it is.
In terms of the legacy, Trent, like that darkness in your early lyrics and in that image that you talked about that was imposed on you to a certain extent, did reflect a lot of disillusioned Gen Xers and what they're feeling, and so you get this massive dedicated fan base. How comfortable were you, or are you, being perceived as the poster boy for the disillusioned masses?
I don't know that I ever was comfortable with that, but it is what it is. I don't think that much about it. You know, I don't feel like I'm carrying that flag right now, or I have that responsibility, you know, of being that guy still, because I'm not that guy, and I'm not going to pretend I am that guy, and I'm not trying to pretend I'm that guy. But that guy's in me, and he was me, and I've been through that, and I'm artistically trying to very consciously be who I am right now and be honest with who I am right now and try to pause and reflect and have my current art reflect what I'm going through.
Confesiones descarnadas, honestas, como la que sigue. Phil Anselmo en la Universidad de Loyola. Esta para mí es una de las charlas favoritas de Phil Anselmo porque habla ante un público netamente universitario, entiendo, contestando sus preguntas, etc. Nos confiesa sobre su adicción a las drogas. Pero además al final de esa entrevista, que no es lo que van a ver ahora en el 7mo vicio, sino que ahora van a ver un pasaje que tiene que ver netamente con él hablándonos sobre lo extremista que es con respecto a todo en la vida. Pero al final de esa entrevista, si tienes la oportunidad de verla completa en YouTube, que está, vas a ver lo amante que es del cine de terror, Phil Anselmo. Y entre otras cosas menciona El orfanato de Juan Antonio Bayona como una de sus películas favoritas, más o menos a la fecha de realización de esa entrevista. Con ustedes, Phil Anselmo, que no toma prisioneros a la hora de hablar.
There is no reason, really, that I can point to. I am an extremist when it comes to everything. Anything I set my mind to, I'm an absolute extremist. I cannot say it any better. And I was injured. I had a back injury from, and I don't suggest anyone do this, but I would climb up on top of PA systems and dive head first either into the waiting crowd or into the waiting concrete, and it made no difference. I would attack on stage, and I paid for it, Jack. I ultimately injured myself, and like putting a Band-Aid over cancer, when you rupture a disc in your back, it begins this thing called degenerative disc disease. So that means the next one's going. And then, you know, obviously the next one after that, and then so on and so forth. Well, I think it was about the time when the record came in at #1. I was pretty terrified. I was happy as hell. Don't get me wrong, man. I was like, oh my God, yes! And at that point, I had just got back from the doctor, my second MRI, and I realized I had 2 blown out discs. Now, in order for me to be this Superman that the media had built me up to be, I had to quell that pain. You understand me? So it started with, and I ain't laughing, man. It is, you know, we can laugh together, but this ain't funny, really. I started off with regular painkillers, which would be your hydrocodone-based painkillers, Loracet, Loratab, whatever. And muscle relaxers. And I'll call one out for the evil that it is. There's one called Soma, which should be yanked off the goddamn market, pardon me, if I slip up with the language sometime. I guess we're all adults, and just remember, it's just words. I didn't invent them. So, eventually you climb up the painkiller ladder, because painkillers lie to you. They will magnify that injury, and that's all that's on your mind, the injury and painkillers. Up the ladder I went, stronger painkillers, stronger painkillers, stronger painkillers, and you hear, and you damn well know, when your audience is looking at you different, when your band members are looking at you different, you know, going, man, what is wrong with Phil? What is wrong with Phil? You get a little tired. You get weary of it. You feel like this 20-something-year-old, which I was, juggernaut, man. You want to leap out of your skin, but you can't anymore. You can't just hang out anymore because it hurts to hang out. Or you're too loaded. And once everyone starts laying this trip on you, That's when you close the door and the needle slides in, Jack. And from that point on, you are on your own. You're on a ride. And I wouldn't suggest anyone in this room, I wouldn't suggest on my worst enemy this particular ride. So, that's where I was, that's my drug background.
Henry Lawrence Garfield, más conocido como Henry Rollins, músico prolífico de los míticos hardcore Black Flag, Rollins Band, colaborador de bandas que van desde Misfits, pasando por Tool, Bad Brains y también una que otra cosita con Iggy Pop. Estamos hablando de un músico, letrista, vocalista, que trasciende incluso a los escenarios como monologuista brillante. Y también con su propio programa de televisión, The Henry Rollins Show, donde conversa, por ejemplo, con Marilyn Manson, Tom Morello, Serj Tankian, Iggy Pop and the Stooges. Henry Rollins, que además es actor. Y probablemente lo has visto y lo recuerdes en películas como la increíble hit Fuego contra Fuego de Michael Mann, o también Los Highway, Carretera Perdida del mismísimo David Lynch, que formó parte de este programa. Y también interpreta a un neonazi en Sons of Anarchy. Henry Rollins se sienta a hablar con otro músico, Pharrell Williams, en un capítulo que se llama Back and Forth, capítulo número 12, si no me equivoco, de Noisy. Y dice algo sobre la educación que todos quisiéramos escuchar.
What's a present day problem that you feel like you have a real solution for? You know, because we're often, as creatives, we often feel like, you know, there are things that we think should change, and we have ideas, and usually they look at us and they, oh, you're a musician, so what do you know?
Or you're a celebrity, or, yeah.
Right. But for you, it's so emotionally grounded where you come from. What's a real problem that you feel like you have a good solution for?
Great question. I think the biggest problems, at least in my country, in our America, all stem from one place. And I think there's only one real solution that you need, which is kind of broad brush. But I really think I'm onto something, and there's nothing new about it.
Come on.
And I'm not the only person who's ever said it by 10 miles.
Let's go. The cameras are rolling. I'm so interested in hearing this.
Well, education. And that is the way out.
Yes.
That's all you need.
That's it.
That's it. And it would solve everything from income disparity to even having an argument about marriage equality. Your prisons would empty.
That's right.
Domestic violence would plummet. Transfer of STDs from one young person to another would fall off the radar. America would be the skinny Elvis for the rest of the world, because you'd have this country full of switched on, very funny, very helpful, incredibly wonderful people, which we are already, but with an intellectual upgrade across the board. The fact that America is not number one in literacy in the world, and we're like way far down the list, should be the albatross that hangs around America's collective neck. I'll debate anyone on this, and I'll win. Because if you want things to get better, I can only look at myself as an example. I'm no genius. But I
disagree, but go ahead.
I was given a fair education. And so why do I not want to rob a liquor store? Why does it not occur to me to go and perpetrate some violence or to blow up something? I think it has a lot to do with my education. Unfortunately, in America, it also has to do with my gender and my ethnicity, which affords me a bit of leeway being a guy and all kinds of access being a white guy. And so that has to change. And so why would anyone be against that? 1865 was the year that America had the chance to get it right, and we failed. That was the end of the Civil War, and that was the beginning of the three Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Eradicating slavery, equal protection under the law, 1868, the 14th, and the 15th, 1870, making race no longer a bar to voting for males. The women had to wait until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. And so Americans got freedom thanks to the 14th Amendment. but we didn't get equality. And that's been America's struggle. Are things getting better? Absolutely. But we have a long way to go. And that is the test of you and I in our time, in this century, in this country, to level that playing field and to come down on equality on every possible angle. And the way you really get that going is education. Because someone who's educated, if they have a sense of where they're from, then they can figure out where they are. And if you really know where you are, then you can lead. Then you can say, here's where we need to go. But only with a firm understanding of what came before can you get to the rest of all of that. And Americans are great. Really good bunch of people. We deserve better. We deserve more transparency in our media. We deserve more representation in our wonderful democracy. And so how do you get that? The same thing that makes everything else better in this country.
Education.
Bingo.
Niñas Araña tiene fecha de estreno para nuestro país este 18 de mayo, con música de Angelo Piratini.
Weona, salimos en el diario.
¡Cállate! Nosotros no estamos protestando acá, nosotros nos estamos manifestando para hacerle entender a la ciudadanía de que nosotros no somos delincuentes. Tú y los robos de tu araña están haciendo mucho más difícil la demanda de nuestras viviendas.
Pero yo flight, si yo no soy delincuente. Nunca me gustó que nos digan la araña. Es como ordinario. ¿Para qué hacemos esto? Para tener cosas bonitas, pues.
Hoy si andáis toda alumbrada de ser famosa ahora.
¿Me dais un autógrafo? Vos nos metiste acá, vos tenés que sacarnos, pues. Ah, súbeme a mí, ¿cómo? Yo voy a salir en la tele contando toda mi experiencia. ¡No! Mira, cabra culiada. ¡Pero mamá! ¡No me digáis mamá!
Las llaman las arañitas.
Pásame la wea. Quédate con eso, Spock. Nosotros no pertenecemos a esta wea. Nosotros somos mejores que ellos, merecemos algo mejor. Cada día puede ser el último, mamá. No te resistas más y vámonos para atrás. Si Dios mira para abajo, a estos weones los ve primero.
Queremos celebrar en el 7mo vicio que Maite Alberdi, la realizadora fantástica de documentales entrañables como La 11 y también El Salvavidas, tenga nuevo documental y se estrena este año, Los Niños, que nos muestra a un grupo de amigos con síndrome de Down que lleva 40 años yendo al mismo colegio, mismos profesores, mismas clases, las mismas rutinas. Sus padres los acompañaban, pero ahora ya no. Entonces, a los 50 años, tienen que tratar de conseguir un trabajo, aprender a cuidarse solos y demostrarle al mundo que ya no son niños. Estreno en junio en nuestro país.
Te voy a olvidar.
Muchas gracias por acompañarme en esta sesión del 7mo vicio. Les recuerdo que DVD Plan es la mejor tienda de películas de nuestro país, en la cual estamos grabando. Este 7mo vicio tiene nueva y flamante tienda ubicada aquí en Paseo Dos Caracoles, Metro Estación Los Leones, en pleno Providencia. Lo mejor del cine clásico, las últimas novedades en 3D, 4K, en Blu-ray, la película que siempre soñaste tener, los últimos estrenos a los precios más convenientes, con la mejor atención, aquí en DVD Planet, que también tiene tienda en San Agustín. Tiene para ustedes, los 7mo viciosos, un concurso espectacular. Fíjense, 5 títulos que obtuvieron nominaciones y también premiaciones en la última edición de los premios de la Academia. Me refiero a Hacksaw Ridge hasta el último hombre, de Mel Gibson, pasando por Manchester by the Sea de Kenneth Lonergan. En pantalla está apareciendo la ganadora del Oscar Moonlight, como también Cuba and the Two Strings, esa joya de maravilla en stop motion a cargo de los Laika Studios, los mismos de Coraline, Paranorman, Box Trolls, entre otros. Y también Arrival de Denis Villeneuve. Todas esas películas, esos 5 títulos en una canasta Oscar de regalo para un solo ganador o ganadora. Participen dándole me gusta al Facebook de DVD Planet Limitada, luego se dirigen al Facebook del 7mo vicio y dejan un comentario, como siempre agregando su mail y nombre para que producción en días venideros pueda notificarlos. Además, les recuerdo que por estos días tienen que estar ahí constantemente revisando el Facebook del 7mo vicio, como mi cuenta de Twitter que está apareciendo en estos momentos en pantalla, porque vamos a estar anunciando los ganadores de Fragmentado, Split, la película de M. Night Shyamalan, que me trastornó, me voló la cabeza, y que se estrena el 16 de marzo. Esos ganadores son para la van premier que toma lugar esa misma semana. Cada invitación es válida para 2 personas. También les recuerdo que estén sondeando ahí, revisando nuestras plataformas, nuestras redes, porque vamos a estar anunciando el concurso para la van premier de La Bella y la Bestia. Vamos a cerrar este 7mo vicio con un trabajo de joyería de investigación y de análisis a cargo de Nerd Writer sobre uno de los iconos visuales más importantes en la historia de la música, las carátulas de los Beatles. Soy el Pelado Pi, el Dr. Simi de las películas. Muchas gracias por acompañarme junto a mi equipo maravilloso del 7mo vicio. Me despido.
I've never been really much of a fan of music videos, and I think that's because I sort of just like my music as music. I like to close my eyes and focus on what's happening sonically, because that's what music is. It's something that you hear. So that means I can be totally engrossed and in love with Beyoncé's latest album and not care at all about the dozen videos that came out with it. But I don't know, maybe I'm in the minority here. And the truth is that despite music being an oral medium, it's long had an intimate relationship with the visual. So I want to talk about perhaps the most iconic visual supplement in the history of music. But before we talk about that, what about album covers in general? These days we perceive them as a kind of visual statement, like the album title or the song names that help us situate the tone or the feeling of what we're going to hear. Granted that it stays within the dimension of a square, the options and styles are basically limitless. But in the beginning, record packaging was purely utilitarian. The early 78 RPM gramophone records were mostly outfitted with brown paper or cardboard sleeves to protect the recording. It wasn't until 1938 when Columbia Records hired Alex Steinweiss as its very first art director that the idea of cover art came into existence. Against the plain or traditional design of early covers, Steinweiss's original eye-catching art initiated just a huge boom in sales, and the market followed, as it always does when something works. Record stores were refigured so that instead of just seeing the bindings like books on a shelf, consumers were encouraged to flip through the covers. This all points to just how important the cover art was to the marketing of the product. And music is a product. It's a commodity that people consume. And since you can't buy the band itself, and since the music has no spatial dimension, the album cover emerged as the stand-in for the commodity to be purchased. This explains the rise of photography on album covers and what's called the personality cover. You know, one of those covers where it's just a photograph of the band or musician, still pretty popular today. A perfect example of this personality cover can be seen on the Beatles' first album, Please Please Me. Just look at those bright, smiling faces staring warmly into the camera lens. As Susan Sontag once brilliantly said, in its simplest form, we have in a photograph surrogate possession of a cherished person or thing. As their career advanced, the Beatles seemed to become darkly aware of their status as commodities, perhaps nowhere more plainly acknowledged than on the cover of their fourth album, aptly titled Beatles for Sale, featuring another example of the personality cover, this time without the warmth and the smiles. By the time Sgt. Pepper's emerged, the Beatles had already begun challenging the conventions of popular music and its role in culture, and this extended to the album covers too. First in Rubber Soul with its distorted image and funky typeface, then with Revolver, for which they employed their friend and artist Klaus Voormann, who did a kind of 1960s update of Victorian illustrator Aubrey Beardsley's famous black ink drawings. In other words, the Beatles were leaders in expanding an album cover's function from a marketing tool to a work of art in its own right. And that brings us back to what is really the holy grail of album covers, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. A cover that explicitly engages the audience in so many ways, in critiques and interpretations, in comparisons and contrasts. It's a cover that invites you in. And a perfect example of this is the immediate challenge to just identify who all of these people are. What do Indian gurus Karl Marx and Bob Dylan all have in common? The Sgt. Pepper's cover wants you to ask questions like this. Now, in one sense, of course, these people just represent the Beatles' interests and influences, many of whom didn't make the final cut. And yet, by juxtaposing highbrow artists and thinkers like Marx or Aubrey Beardsley or George Bernard Shaw or Dylan Thomas with pop icons like Bob Dylan, Marilyn Monroe, Marlon Brando, and Shirley Temple, the Beatles signal the breakdown and mixing of high and low culture that they themselves exemplified more than any other artist. With Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles were in a posture of challenge, challenging everything they'd been up to that point, challenging the highbrow art critics to abandon their exclusion of popular culture, challenging the listening public to engage with something other than love songs in the same four chords. They were even challenging the feelings of unity that defined the summer of love in 1967, delivering a suite of songs that featured alienation and loss as much as it did love and togetherness. The album cover echoes these challenges and adds some of its own. By using the technique of photo montage, which manipulates photography's unique ability to depict reality, the Beatles blend and collapse the values of a number of different times and places. By staging the scene as a performance and an audience, the band challenges us to dwell on the function of both. Indeed, these considerations were at the front of their minds as the Beatles had only recently elected to stop performing live after the mayhem of Beatlemania began to diminish the quality of the music. While some accuse them of leaving their fans behind, the Sgt. Pepper's cover suggests the opposite, that the decision to stop touring was out of respect for their fans, not out of fear or contempt. We should also note that the designer of this cover, Peter Blake, was a noted pop artist, a style that used aspects of mass culture to bring attention to the fuzzy lines between art, advertising, news, and all other forms of media. The pop artists wanted to get people to think about the process and manufacturing of art and how its categorizations and hierarchies are largely arbitrary. Blake and the Beatles designed the Sgt. Pepper cover as both a piece of art and a product. Inside its gatefold sleeve, the record had paper cutouts of the Pepper Band's regalia, adding to its consumer kitsch value. And yet it was also the first album to display the lyrics on the packaging, encouraging listeners to interrogate the record's intellectual content as well. Now, the truth is, of course, that music, perhaps more prominently than any other art form, plays both parts as a commodity and an aesthetic object. And in many ways, the two functions are inseparable. The Beatles knew this, and maybe they regretted it, but they were self-aware enough to see that it was inescapable. And if music had to be marketed, and if the visual was going to be the vehicle of that, John, Paul, George, and Ringo were going to be as playful here as they were with everything else. In the end, this photograph of photographs levels a critique on representation itself. To show how music is mediated by the visual, the Beatles put themselves on this cover 3 times. Once as the wax figures of the mop-top Beatles that they were, once as the fake Pepper Band in its bright and eye-catching glory, and finally as themselves, pictured not on the cover of their album, but by the effects of that cover in the minds of everyone who looked at it. The real Beatles can't be represented this way. Not really. Not like this, or like this, or like this. The cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band points to the truth, what the Beatles themselves knew, that all music is invisible.
I read the news today.